Okay, in this video we are going to do some examples using the half-angle formulas for sine and cosine. So there's a couple things you need to know before you can really use the formulas. So the first thing you need to know is you need to know the formulas. So the sine of a over 2 is equal to plus or minus, so that part's a little weird. So plus or minus is square root of 1 minus cosine of a over 2. And then we'll also need the formula for cosine of a over 2, which looks very similar. So the formula here is cosine of a over 2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 1 plus the cosine of a over 2. So the way that I kind of remember which one's plus and which one's minus, like, just kind of seems like cosine should go with cosine. And so that's where plus comes from. Whereas it seems like sine, it seems like the sine formula should probably have sine in it, but it doesn't. These both come from the double angle formulas for cosine, which is why cosine shows up in the formula both times. But I just remember the cosine formula. Cosine of a over 2 has a plus. Okay, so after you know the formulas, you have to know how to deal with that plus or minus that's in front. So that comes down to how are you going to pick whether it's positive or negative, right? So the sine or cosine of an angle can't be positive and negative. So we're going to have to decide how to pick that. And then, as with most things trig, you're going to basically need to know the unit circle and the values on the unit circle. Those kind of never go away as you do more and more trig. So let's take a look at an example. All right, so we're going to find the sine of 7 pi over 12. And so the first thing I like to do is get a sense of where 7 pi over 12 is, because that'll tell me if its sine is positive or negative. So I'm going to draw some axes. So since it's over 12, I'm going to label pi over 2, but I'm going to label it as 6 pi over 12, right? So I'm using 12 as the denominator since the angle that I'm interested in is over 12. And I know 7 pi over 12 is just a little bit more than that, so I can draw it. And so that's my angle, 7 pi over 12. And now I want to figure out should my sine or cosine, should sine be positive or negative? So we got ASTC. We're in the second quadrant, which means that sine will be positive. So when we do the plus or minus, we're just going to use the plus. So when we get to that, I'll talk it through again. Now I need to figure out what is this half of. So sometimes students aren't sure should they use the half angle formula. The way you can figure out if you can use the half angle formula is to figure out if the angle you're trying to find the sine or cosine of is half of an angle that you know the sine or cosine of. Really, you need to know the cosine, but if you know the cosine, you definitely know the sine. So I'm going to try to solve this. So a over 2 is equal to 7 pi over 12. And when I solve for a, I get a is 7 pi over 6, and I do know the cosine of that, so I can definitely use the half angle formula. All right, so now I want to do that. So the sine of 7 pi over 12 is equal to the sine of 7 pi over 6 over 2. And you just simplify that, and you can see that that's definitely true. And so the angle we'll be using in the formula is 7 pi over 6. And then we decided, because we were in the second quadrant, that the sine of that angle is definitely positive, because in the second quadrant, sine is always positive. So we're going to go with the positive square root of 1 minus, because we're using the half angle formula for sine. So 1 minus cosine of 7 pi over 6 over 2. Remember that over 2, that 2 there is actually inside the radical. I see a lot of people make that mistake. And now it's just simplification. So this, I need to remember the cosine rather, of 7 pi over 6, but I know that's negative root 3 over 2 because I memorized just all those values, which is definitely worth your time. And then all this is over 2. I'm going to simplify just the numerator. So I get this. So minus negative becomes plus, and so 2 plus root 3 over 2, all over 2. I can simplify that again to get this. So a complex fraction, you simplify it, you get over 4. But 4 is a perfect square, so I'm going to take the square root of it and get square root of 2 plus root 3. So 2 plus root 3 is inside the square root, and then all over 2. All right, so that's one example. We ended up with a positive value because we're in the second quadrant with the initial angle. So remember, that's, I think, maybe the hardest thing to remember is you're deciding plus or minus based on the actual angle that you're finding the sine or cosine of. Let's do another example with cosine. So we want to find the cosine of 11 pi over 8. We're going to do basically the same thing. I want to decide where it is. So it's definitely bigger than pi. So I'm thinking pi is going to be 8 pi over 8. And then 3 pi over 2 would be 12 pi over 8. And so I'm definitely in there. So I'm really close there. And that's our angle. And then we want to think, is the cosine going to be positive or negative? So we have ASTC. We're in the third quadrant, which means only tangent and cotangent are positive. So we're going to go with negative and then go from there. Okay, so let's figure out what this is half of. So a over 2 is 11 pi over 8, which means that a is 11 pi over 4. So that's bigger than 2 pi, but it is over 4. So I know that I definitely know the cosine of it. So I'm just going to dive in and see what happens. So we have cosine of 11 pi over 8 is the cosine of, so it's 11 pi over 4, and then divide that by 2. And so we're using 11 pi over 4 in the formula. So it's going to be, we're in the third quadrant, so we know that cosine is negative, so negative square root of 1, and then it's plus because we're doing cosine of a over 2, so plus the cosine of our angle that we found, cosine of 11 pi over 4, and then all over 2. Okay, and now I want to deal with the 11 pi over 4. So 11 pi over 4 is bigger than 2 pi, but it's not like so much bigger that I want to do something complicated. I'm just going to subtract 2 pi, and that's going to give me 3 pi over 4. And so since 11 pi over 4 is coterminal to 3 pi over 4, their cosines are the same. And that's good because I know the cosine of 3 pi over 4. That's just negative root 2 over 2. And let's substitute that. So we have that this is equal to, so we're putting in our negative root 2 over 2, and then that's all over 2. And now it's just a simplification problem. So we get this, and then that 4 is inside the radical, so the square root of 4 is 2. And so we're going to get the cosine of 11 pi over 8 is the negative of root 2 minus root 2 all over 2. All right, so that's 2 examples. It's really dealing with that. Should it be positive or negative? And then figuring out the angle that you're going to actually substitute into the formula. I hope you found this helpful, and good luck.